There are two kinds of silence. The first kind is chosen. It belongs to people who have learned that not every thought needs to be spoken, that listening is its own form of intelligence, that the world becomes clearer when you stop filling it with your own noise. This is a silence that costs something and gives something back in equal measure. The second kind is not chosen. It is imposed by fear, by shame, by the accumulated weight of being told, in ways both direct and subtle, that what you have to say is not worth hearing. This silence costs everything and gives nothing back at all. Daniel had lived in the second kind of silence for as long as he could remember. He was the elder son of a salt merchant in a city that never stopped moving. His father was a practical man in the way that people become practical when survival has required it of them, not cruel by nature, but worn down to a kind of impatience by years of hard work and narrow margins, a man who had learned to measure everything by its usefulness and had, without quite meaning to, applied that measurement to his sons. The younger son passed easily. He was quick, sociable, comfortable in his own skin in the way that some people simply are, as if they arrived in the world already knowing that they belonged there. Customers liked him, strangers warmed to him. He filled rooms the way sunlight fills rooms, without effort, without asking permission. Daniel filled rooms differently. He made himself small in them. He sat in corners at family gatherings and spoke only when directly addressed and answered in the fewest words the question would allow. Not because he had nothing to say, his mind was busy and observant and capable of noticing things that the louder people around him missed entirely, but because somewhere along the way he had learned that speaking led to outcomes he could not control, and the safest response to that uncertainty was silence. His father called it stupidity. The neighbors called it strangeness. Daniel called it nothing because he had no language for it yet. He only knew that it lived in his chest like a stone, heavy and permanent, and that every year it seemed to grow slightly heavier. The scolding started early and never really stopped. His father was not a man who believed in gentleness as a pedagogical tool. He believed in directness, in naming things as they were, in the idea that if you told a person clearly enough what was wrong with them, they would eventually fix it.
Why did they do this?
This approach had never worked on Daniel. It had produced the opposite effect, contracting him further into himself with each correction. But his father interpreted the contraction as stubbornness rather than injury and responded with more directness, and the cycle continued. By the time Daniel was a teenager, the stone in his chest had become something architectural. It was not just a feeling anymore. It had shaped the way he moved through rooms, the way he held his body, the way his voice worked when it was forced to emerge thin and apologetic, as if it was sorry for taking up the air. His studies suffered. Not because he was incapable. His teachers, on the rare occasions when they looked closely enough, saw a mind that understood things it had never been taught, but because examinations required him to demonstrate what he knew in front of people who would judge the demonstration, and that requirement activated something in him that shut down everything else. He would sit before a blank page knowing the answer, and find that the knowing and the writing were separated by something he could not cross. He fell behind, then further behind, then far enough behind that catching up became a project requiring more confidence than he had, and so he stopped trying, and the falling behind became permanent, and the permanent falling behind became another piece of evidence in the case his father was building against him. The case, by the time Daniel was a young man, was very nearly complete. He came to work in the shop because there was nowhere else to go. He did not want to be there. Not because he was lazy or ungrateful or indifferent to his family's circumstances. He was none of those things. But because the shop required him to speak to strangers, to answer questions, to present himself with a confidence he did not possess to people who would notice its absence immediately. He made mistakes. Of course, he made mistakes. A person operating at the outer limit of their endurance, in an environment that activates their deepest fears, who knows that every error will be met with exactly the response that made them afraid in the first place, that person makes mistakes. This is not weakness. It is physics. His father saw weakness. The day the cunning men came to the shop was an ordinary Tuesday. There were two of them, and they were practiced in the way that people who make a living from deception become practiced, fluent, confident, carrying themselves with the particular authority of people who know that authority, performed well enough, is indistinguishable from the real thing. They told Daniel his father had sent them. They gave details. They had the names right, the manner right, the timing right. And Daniel, who had spent his entire life being told that his instincts were wrong, that his hesitation was stupidity, that the confident person in the room was always the one to be trusted, Daniel did what he had been trained to do. He doubted himself. He watched them carry the salt sacks out of the shop and felt, with each sack that disappeared through the door, the sick certainty that something was wrong. But the certainty was quiet, the way Daniel's certainties always were. And the men were loud, the way deception usually is. And he had learned long ago which of those things to trust. By the time his father came home, the shop was empty. The words his father said that evening were the worst words he had ever heard. Not because they were new, his father had been building toward them for years, but because they were final. There was no correction implied, no possibility of improvement. Just the verdict, delivered in the voice of a man who had run out of patience and was no longer interested in what patience might have produced. Get out. Never come back. Daniel walked to the river. Not with a clear intention at first. Just walking because movement was the only alternative to standing in place with what had happened, and standing in place with what had happened was not something he could do. But by the time he reached the water, the intention had clarified. He stood at the edge and looked at the river moving past, indifferent, continuous, completely unbothered by his presence or absence, and thought about how easy it would be. How much simpler it would be to simply stop, to stop the stone in his chest, and the voice in his head that had been narrating his failures since childhood, and the particular loneliness of being in a world that seemed designed for people who were nothing like him. There is no point. I will always fail. I am not made for this. The thoughts were very loud and very clear and felt, in that moment, entirely true. He did not hear the old man approaching. The old man's name was Joseph, and he was 71 years old, and he had been sitting on that riverbank most evenings for 20 years, because the river reminded him of something his wife had said before she died, that moving water is proof that things change, that nothing stays in one shape forever, that even the most solid-seeming obstacle is, given enough time and enough patient water, something that gets worn away. He had seen the look on Daniel's face from 30 meters away. He moved quickly for a man his age. When he grabbed Daniel's arm, the young man turned on him with a desperation that was almost anger, the desperate anger of someone whose decision has been interrupted. At the moment it finally felt like relief. Why did you do that? What is my life worth? I cannot do anything right. I have no education. My own father has rejected me. What is the point of continuing? Joseph did not answer immediately. He had learned, in 71 years, that the first words spoken after a question like that are almost always the wrong ones. He sat down on the bank. He waited. And then he said, very quietly, "Come home with me. I have something I want to show you." Joseph's house was small and full of the particular warmth of a space that has been lived in thoughtfully for a long time. Books on every surface. A kitchen that smelled like something had been cooking slowly for hours. Photographs on the walls not arranged decoratively, but placed where they had meaning, which meant they were everywhere. He made tea. He said nothing about what had happened at the river. Finally, when the tea was finished, he looked at Daniel across the table and said, "I am going to ask you to do 3 things over the next 3 days. Not because I think they will fix you, you are not broken. But because I think you have spent so long listening to other people's assessment of you, that you have forgotten you are also capable of making your own." Daniel said nothing. He was listening in the way that very quiet people listen when something has genuinely caught their attention completely, with no part of him elsewhere. The first thing, Joseph said, is to talk to 10 strangers. Not to sell them anything, not to perform, just to ask about their lives and listen to what they say. The first stranger Daniel approached on the following morning was a woman selling fruit at a corner stall, and the approaching took him 11 minutes. He stood at a distance and watched her, and had the conversation in his head 17 times, and talked himself out of it 15 of those times, and then talked himself back in twice, and on the second time, he walked forward before he could change his mind again and said, with a voice that came out slightly higher than he intended, "Excuse me, I was wondering how long have you been selling fruit here?" She looked at him. He waited for the dismissal, the impatience, the look that said, "Why are you talking to me?" She said, 32 years. My mother had this stall before me. And then, because she was a woman who had been selling fruit on that corner for 32 years and had developed opinions about it, she kept talking. Daniel listened. He asked one more question, then another, not because he was following a strategy, but because he was genuinely interested, because this woman's life was more interesting than he had expected, because there was something that happened in the act of listening that was different from anything he had experienced in a long time. She noticed him, not as a problem or a disappointment or a puzzle to be solved, just as a person who was paying attention. And she responded to that, noticing the way most people respond when someone actually pays attention to them. She talked to him like he was worth talking to. By the end of the day, he had spoken to 10 people. 2 had ignored him. 1 had been briefly rude. 7 had talked to him with the ordinary warmth of people who are asked genuine questions and respond in kind. And among those 7, he had made he would not have used the word friend. It felt too large for a single afternoon, but something adjacent to it, 2 connections that felt real. He walked back to Joseph's house in the early evening and felt something in his chest that was not the stone, something lighter. Something that he could not name, but that had not been there that morning. The second day was harder. Teach 10 children why water is important. Stand before them and speak. Use your voice as a tool rather than a liability. Daniel arrived at the small community center where Joseph had arranged for a group of children to be waiting, and stood outside the door for a long time, and thought very seriously about leaving. He did not leave. He went in. The children looked at him. He looked at the children. He picked up the glass of water Joseph had left on the table, and held it, and thought about what he actually knew about water. Not what he should know, not what an educated person would know, just what he knew, and began to talk. His voice was quiet at first. The children in the back leaned forward to hear it. This small act of leaning, this unconscious signal that they wanted to hear what he was saying, did something to him. His voice got slightly louder. By the end, he was not performing. He was just talking, telling these children things he knew about something he had never thought to consider worth sharing. And they were listening not because they had to. Children are not good at pretending to listen, but because something in the straightforwardness of his manner, the absence of pretension or performance, made them feel that he was speaking to them rather than at them. When he finished, a small girl in the front row raised her hand and asked a question. He answered it. She nodded, satisfied. She trusted the answer. And something that had been sealed inside Daniel for most of his life cracked open, very slightly, and let in a small amount of light. The third day, Joseph said simply, "Go home. Apologize to your father. Not because you were wrong. You were not wrong in any way that matters. But because the relationship is broken and someone has to be the one to try to fix it, and you are capable of being that person." Daniel did not want to do this. He wanted to do it less than he had wanted to do either of the previous 2 tasks, and he had not wanted to do those at all. "What if he rejects me again?" "Then you will have tried," Joseph said. "That is all any of us can do. Try, and then try again, and keep trying until the trying becomes something." He walked home slowly. His father was in the back of the shop, doing inventory, when Daniel arrived. He looked up. His face closed in the automatic way that faces close when they are preparing for confrontation. Daniel spoke first. He did not apologize for being who he was. He had spent his entire life apologizing for being who he was, and he was finished with that. He apologized for the salt, for the failure of attention that had allowed it to happen, for the cost it had caused. He promised, not with the desperate promise of someone trying to ward off punishment, but with the quiet promise of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is informing the relevant parties. His father listened. Something in the quality of Daniel's voice was different. His father noticed it without being able to name it. It was the difference between a person speaking from fear and a person speaking from decision, and even someone who had never learned to name that difference can feel it. He said, "Come back tomorrow." It was not forgiveness. It was not warmth. But it was a door that had been closed and was now slightly open. Daniel walked back to Joseph's house in the late afternoon and sat down across from the old man and said, "Now tell me the secret." Joseph smiled. "You have already discovered it," he said. "Look at what you did this week. You spoke to strangers and they responded. You taught children and they listened. You went to your father and he opened a door. None of those things happened because you suddenly became a different person. They happened because you stopped letting fear make your decisions for you." He leaned forward. Confidence is not the absence of fear. Every person who has ever done anything worth doing has done it afraid. Confidence is the decision to act anyway, to walk through the door anyway, to speak anyway, to try anyway. He paused. "You know how to do that now. You did it 3 times this week. All you have to do is keep doing it." Daniel sat with this for a long time. Then he said, "I thought I was born wrong." "No one is born wrong," Joseph said simply. "Some people are born into circumstances that make them believe they are. That is a different thing entirely. The years that followed were not easy." This is important to say because the stories we tell about transformation almost always skip the middle part, the long, unglamorous stretch between the moment of revelation and the moment of arrival, during which the person is neither who they were nor yet who they are becoming, and the work is hard and the progress is slow, and there are days when the stone in the chest comes back, and the old silence feels like the only safe place. Daniel had many of those days. He had them when customers dismissed him, when deals fell through, when his father's impatience surfaced in the old familiar way. He had them when he tried something and failed, and when he succeeded and still felt, underneath the success, the ghost of the person who had stood at the river's edge and believed there was no point in continuing. But he also had other days. Days when a customer thanked him in a way that felt genuine. Days when he solved a problem that his more confident colleagues had not thought to look for. Days when he sat across from someone and listened, really listened, with the complete attention of someone who had learned that listening is its own form of presence, and watched the person across from him visibly relax into being heard. He had a gift for that. He had always had a gift for that. He had just never been in a position to recognize it as a gift rather than a limitation. Quietness, he learned, was not the opposite of strength. It was a different kind of strength. The strength of observation, of patience, of being present in a room without demanding that the room arrange itself around you, these were not lesser qualities. They were simply less visible ones. And visibility, he had learned, was not the same thing as value. Years later, when people asked him about his success, and they did ask, because the business he built was genuinely impressive, built on a reputation for integrity and attentiveness that his louder competitors found difficult to match, he would tell them about Joseph. About the stranger on the riverbank who had grabbed his arm and sat him down and asked him to do 3 things. About the fruit seller who had talked to him like he was worth talking to. About the small girl who had trusted his answer. About his father who had opened a door that Daniel had then spent years walking through. He would tell them, "The secret is not that fear goes away. The secret is that you stop waiting for it to go away before you begin. Wherever you are reading this, whatever silence you are living in, whatever stone is sitting in your chest, whatever voice has been telling you for however long that you are not enough, that you are too quiet, too slow, too behind, too broken to be worth the space you occupy. I want to tell you something that Daniel learned on a riverbank from an old man who had been waiting there for exactly the right moment. You are not the verdict that fear has reached about you. You are what happens when you act despite it. Not once. Not in a single transforming moment on a rainy evening, but again and again, imperfectly, with shaking hands and a voice that comes out slightly higher than you intended, toward the life that is waiting on the other side of the door you have been standing outside of for too long. Walk through it. Not when you are ready. You will not be ready. No one is ever ready. Walk through it now, afraid, exactly as you are, and see what happens.